Hello everyone, here's a video explaining in more detail how to configure a service in Nagios monitoring. In Nagios, a service typically monitors something very specific. For example, you might have one service to monitor the CPU usage of Windows machines, another to track memory usage on those machines, and yet another to check the network ports of a device on your network. In short, one service per thing you want to monitor. So, here's my strategy for my upcoming Nagios videos. I'll create several short videos, each focusing on a specific thing to monitor. For example, one video might explain how to check if a particular process on a Linux machine is running. Another to check once a day if a SSL certificate is expired or will expire on the next month. These short videos will include a detailed explanation of that specific configuration for this service. But I won't repeat all these redundant basics configuration like alert options, monitoring frequency, and so on. That's why in this video we're going to cover all these common elements you can configure in a Nagios service. I'll explain the basics of defining a service, how to assign it to a host or host group, and then we'll go through all the available services configuration options together. You'll be able to pick and choose the options you need when you build your own service setup. As a prerequisite for this video, you'll need a Nagios server installed and at least one host configured in your Nagios environment. Check out my Nagios playlist or the video description for a list of videos that can help you to meet these prerequisites if you need assistance. So let's get started with creating a service in Nagios. Head over to the directory where your Nagios objects are configured. If you installed Nagios from the Ubuntu repositories, as I showed in a previous video, the object configurations will be in this directory. In my case, I created in the previous video a dedicated file for services called services.cfg. You'll need admin privileges to edit this file. This is why I used sudo in front of the command and why it prompts for my user password. In that earlier video, we left this file empty since I hadn't configured any services to monitor yet. But now, here's a configuration I'll paste into this file to monitor the network port 80 on a machine. This is a minimal configuration with just the essentials to check if a machine is listening on port 80. With only these options, the monitoring should work, assuming you installed Nagios the way I did. Let's check these options and then we'll enhance this configuration with additional options. Every service you configure in Nagios must start with the define service line followed by braces. All options for this service will be in the braces. The use line specifies which configuration template this service will inherit from. After installing Nagios from the Ubuntu repositories, as I did, there's a default template called generic service with pre-configured options for services. What's a template for? It's a way to configure common options across multiple services. The real benefit of a template comes when, say, you have 40 different services configured on your Nagios server, and most of them share the same settings. For example, 24/7 monitoring, check it every 5 minutes, and email alerts to your network admins in case of issues. Instead of repeating those options in every service definition, you can create a template, add those settings there, and reference it with the use option followed by the template name. In my case, the template name is generic-service. Let's quickly look at the templates.cfg file together. Here's what my templates.cfg looks like. All my templates are defined in this file. There's a template for contacts, but that's not our focus for this video. We're looking for the first service template. Here is one for hosts and another one. I can tell this because they start with the define host instruction. There we go, a defined service line. The first one is the generic service template we have seen. Further down, there's another one called local service. Those are the only two that come with my default Nagios installation. So just like the service we're configuring, templates start with defined service. The only difference is that a template must include the register option set to 0. This tells Nagios it's not a regular service, but a template. all the other options defined in the template can also be used in a regular service configuration, like the one I'm setting up now. What happens if an option is specified multiple times across your Nagios configurations with different values? The one defined directly in the service takes priority. For example, imagine a service monitoring CPU usage on a Linux server is set to check every 3 minutes. It also uses a Linux service template, which is configured to check every 5 minutes. That template, in turn, uses generic service, where the check interval is set to 10 minutes. In this case, the service's 3-minute interval configuration takes priority. If the service didn't specify this option, the 5-minute interval from Linux service template would apply. That's how templates work in Nagios. Next, in our new configuration, you need to specify the host name or host group. This determines which machines this service will be monitored. You can list specific host names directly in the service config, but the downside is that if you add or remove a host from your Nagios setup later, you'd need to update every service definition manually used for this host. If you want to use this way, use the hostname option and list the host names to monitor for this service, separated by commas if there are multiple. Personally, I prefer using host groups. You define the host group once in the service, then assign this group on the host configuration. This makes it much easier to add or remove hosts. To add a host, you just copy a similar existing host config, tweak a few options, and you're done. To remove one, you delete or comment out its config. No need to hunt through other config files. Normally, in my config, I typically create host groups named Ubuntu server for all my Ubuntu servers, Windows server for all my Windows servers, web server for my web servers, etc. Basically, one group per machine type. Of course, a machine can belong to both the Ubuntu group and the web server group. For this example, where I'm monitoring the network port 80, I'll use the web server host group for all my web servers listening on HTTP port 80. A quick note, the order of these options doesn't matter. It'll work as long as they're within the define service configuration block. The service description option is a short human-readable description of the service. Spaces are allowed here. The check command is the Nagios command used to perform the check. Several commands come pre-installed with Nagios, but you can also define custom ones in a dedicated command config file. For now, we'll use the built-in command to check a network port which was included when I installed Nagios. I'll cover other available commands in future videos tailored to specific monitoring needs, like checking an SSL certificate or disk space on a Windows machine. Each video will detail the necessary command to configure and use, its options, and anything you need to install or configure to make it work. For this video, the command I'm using should be available by default after installing Nagios on Ubuntu server 24.04 from the Ubuntu repository. If it's not, you'd need to add it. I'll cover that in an upcoming video focused on network port monitoring. For now, these basic options should be okay to monitor your network port. Other mandatory options are already set on the generic service template we looked at earlier. If you want to test this quickly without adding more options, check the chapter list in this video. Jump to the part about assigning this service to a host and give it a try. So now, what other options can we add to this service config? Let's explore that together. To see all the available options for a Nagios services, I'll point you to a handy resource I use often, the object definitions page from the Nagios documentation page. It covers options for hosts, host groups, contacts, time periods, and, of course, services, which is what we're interested for this video. Clicking the services link brings up an example configuration with many available options for a service. The ones in red are mandatory when defining a service. You might have noticed that my earlier config didn't include them explicitly, and it will still work. It's because these settings are configured in a template, and that template is used by my service. So the service inherits these settings from the template. If you define a service without a template or if the template lacks something like the check period, Nagios will throw an error during config validation, telling you to specify it. Here's a minimal example of a service without a template. Each option also comes with a short English description. Back to my service config, let's open the templates.cfg file again. As I mentioned, all these options can be set directly in the service if you prefer. To explain them, I'll copy this example config, paste it into the service, and trim out unnecessary or rarely used options. I'll focus on the ones I use regularly to keep things simple. If needed, I can dig deeper into the less common options I used. I will need to test them to be sure I give you the good information about them. Here are the main options I rely on in my Nagios configs. They cover most of my service monitoring needs. Notifications enabled controls whether notifications must be sent, example emails alerts. Set to 0 to disable alerts for this service or 1 to enable them. Check period defines when this service is checked. Nagios has a timeperiods.cfg file with predefined time periods like 24/7. That means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For workstations used from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., you could create a custom time period with this need and apply it here. I'll make a dedicated video on time periods if you're interested. Let me know in the comments. I also talk about it on my video about email alerts. Max check attempts is the number of times Nagios retries a check if the service isn't okay before sending an alert. Check interval is how often, in minutes, the service is checked when it is on a normal state. Here, it is every 10 minutes. Retry interval is how often, in minutes, Nagios checks the service when it is on a non-OK state. Here it is every 2 minutes. Notification interval is how often, in minutes, notifications are sent again if the issue persists. Here, it is every 60 minutes. Let's explain how these notifications options work with an example. Let's say you're monitoring CPU usage on a Windows machine and want an email if CPU usage exceeds 80%. With these check and notification settings, Nagios will check this service every 10 minutes. If the CPU is at 20%, the service will be OK and green in the Nagios console. If it spikes to 90%, it will enter on critical state. Nagios will then check every 2 minutes, and after 3 failed attempts, it will send an alert. If the issue lasts an hour, you'll get another email, and you will receive an email every 60 minutes until the issue is resolved. You'll need to tweak these options based on your needs. Less critical services might only need daily checks, while others might need minute-by-minute verification. For CPU monitor, brief spikes to 80% might be normal. So max check attempt setting helps avoid false alerts. You will only receive an email if the issue persists. So let's go back to our TCP port 80 service example. Every 10 minutes, Nagios checks if the port is open on the assigned machines. If it's down, for example, the web server stops, a firewall blocks it, or the network fails, it will retry every 2 minutes. After 3 failures, you will receive an email alert, repeated hourly until it is fixed. For the contacts or contact groups, it specifies who will get the alerts. Here, it's the admin's contact group. You can manage this in the contacts.cfg config file. A default admins group comes with Nagios, with a default contact too, named Nagios admin. You can edit its email address there. I have a video on setting up Nagios to send emails alert. Check it out if you need more information about contacts in Nagios. Notification options defines which states will trigger notifications. W is for warning, U for unknown, C for critical, and R for recovery. For example, you might only want to receive email alerts for critical and unknown states, but not for warnings or when it has recovered to a normal state. For this check TCP command, the possible states are simple. If the port is open, it will be okay. If it is closed, it will be critical. But with CPU monitoring, you could, for example, set warning at 70% and critical at 80%. It will be shown in yellow or red in the console depending on the state, but emails can only be sent for critical state. Notification period are when notifications are sent. For example, 24/7. It is different from the check period setting. You can configure to check a service 24/7, but only get emails from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. weekdays. So these are the options I use most. Others exist, but I'd need to test them more to explain them well. Check the documentation page I mentioned earlier or comment with your specific needs. I'll consider a video about it if there are demands. A quick reminder, I didn't need to specify these mandatory options in my service configuration because they're included in the generic service template. Save and close the services.cfg config file. Now, let's assign this service to a host. In my current configuration, I put the web server host group in my service configuration, but it's not set to any hosts yet. So no monitoring will happen if I restart the service, and Nagios will error out because the group isn't defined. Every object in Nagios host services host groups needs a defined block. I'll define this host group. You could add it anywhere, like in the hosts.cfg config file. But in my case, I prefer to use a dedicated host groups.cfg file for my host groups. Here's how to do this. Create a new file in /etc/nagios/objects/. Adjust the path if your setup differs. Paste this. Define host group. Host group name. A single word identifier for this host group. Alias is a friendlier multi-word description. Save the config file. Since it's a new file, we must add it to Nagios' main config file. Put it under the object config section. Save that config file too. Now open your host's config file. I've only have one host, ubiserv01, set up from my last video to just ping it. I'll add host groups web server. You can list multiple groups. For example, Linux server, MySQL server, web server, with commas to separate each host group. Save and close the config file. After any config change, verify it with the Nagios' validation tool. If it shows 0 warnings or errors, restart the Nagios service. This tool checks syntax error, invalid options, and undefined objects, like a missing host referenced in a service. I'll make a video on troubleshooting validation errors later. So now head to the Nagios web console under the Services page. For my ubiserv01 machine, you'll see all assigned services for this one. Here, it's just my new TCP port 80 check. If the service is pending, gray, in the Nagios console, that's normal for a new service. The first check takes a few minutes. To speed it up, you can click on the service, click Reschedule the next check, and commit. Check back the services page in 5 seconds. The service check should be done. Mine is red because no web server is running on ubiserv 01. I will install Apache. I will confirm it's running and test the default page. After a few minutes or another forced check, the service turns green. So, that concludes this video about Nagios. As you can see, I aim to create a video for each topic. If you need help or information on another subject related to Nagios, I invite you to check out my Nagios monitoring playlist. If you don't find a video that addresses your needs, please leave a comment. Maybe it will be done in a future video, or maybe someone can answer your question directly in the comments. Feel free to comment as well to let me know if you use Nagios, if one of my videos helped you, or if you enjoyed any of my content. I always appreciate your feedback. You probably already know how to support someone on YouTube. You can like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, or even leave a tip. We never know. Maybe one of my videos saved your life. Perhaps you found yourself in a critical situation where everything was about to explode if you didn't fix the problem, and one of my videos helped you resolve it. So that's it. The only thing left to do is wish you a great day. Bye bye!